Okay, so namaskar, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I am Dr. Prabin Khadka, one of the coordinators for this webinar. Welcome to episode 16 of the IIDS webinar series on politics, economy, and public policy. Our speaker for today is Dr. Shishir, who is an assistant professor of economics in the Department of Economics at the Shippensburg University of Pennsylvania. Professor Shakya is an applied economist by training and received his MA and PhD in economics from West Virginia University. His research includes health, energy, and public economics. Dr. Shakya teaches managerial economics and regional economics and has also taught economic analysis of big data, principles of economics, principles of macroeconomics, managerial economics, business data visualization, and elementary business and economic statistics. In fact, if any of our viewers today would like to reach out to Dr. Shakya to follow up on what he does, his great work, please feel free to write. Dr. Shakya's work has been published in some of the leading econ journals. Today, Dr. Shakya is presenting an interesting paper which just got accepted in the World Development, a very prestigious journal covering development studies. The paper co-authored with two other co-authors is titled Natural Disasters and Labor Migration, Evidence from Nepal's Earthquake. Our discussant today is Dr. Rabia Malik, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Government at the University of Essex since July 2020. In fact, Dr. Malik and I joined Essex at the same time. Dr. Malik has a PhD in political science from the University of Rochester, after which she was a postdoc at New York University, Abu Dhabi. Prior joining University of Essex, Dr. Malik was an assistant professor at the prestigious Lahore University of Management Sciences, also known as LUMS. Her research focuses on comparative politics in developing countries, in particular topics related to distributed politics and development, political accountability, clientelism, gender, and South Asia. Dr. Malik has published in the Journal of Politics, the British Journal of Political Science, and Comparative Political Science. Please, some of our ground rules, please keep your mics muted unless you are invited to speak. Dr. Shakya will first speak for about 30 to 40 minutes, which will be followed by comments from Dr. Malik. Please send your questions using the chat forum, or you can raise your hands using the Zoom feature. Dr. Shakya, over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Prabin sir. Thank you so much. Thank you, IIDS, for inviting me. This is a really fascinating time for me to, talk this topic. And looking back, IIDS has been very fertile ground for young researcher like me. I was in IIDS way like 5 years back, and we also have Home Panta sir here. I was also trained under him and studied computable general equilibrium model. And we have also some young colleague or young scholars here. Siddhartha, I can see him there. And a few more, I think those are connected with me in social media. So again, very fascinating. I'm really excited to talk this paper about. So this paper is a joint venture with Subuna and Jayas. So actually it comes, so Subuna comes with this idea about understanding labor migration and natural disasters. She was mostly interested on the political economic dynamics when we initially talked, and it was her dissertation, master's dissertation chapter indeed. And then we started to kind of talk around, and then we created our very first draft on actually how to measuring this thing. So we went from like political economy side to like measurement side. And then like, this is my very first development paper. I usually work in US related with the US health related issue. So this is kind of very first work in development sphere, despite the fact I do involve in several other research work within the development economics. And after we draft the paper, and we know Jayas has been working on earthquakes, and he's also, I think, affiliated with IIDS and have presented in IIDS way earlier, like 3-4 months ago. And I reached out to Jayas, and we kind of came up with a really nice collaboration. So again, every paper has its own journey, and I encourage young researchers to reach out to the people and talk their ideas and figure a way out to, complete a paper and then get it done, right? So let's begin. Let me share the screen here. So this is a joint work, as I said you earlier. Can you see my screen? Can you see my slides?
Yes, Dr. Shakya, thank you.
All right, appreciate that. So this paper, again, came as a joint work with Subuna and Jess. And So our broader research question, maybe a very broader question, is how natural disaster affects migration process. And when you look into migration, there can be different types of migration process, like environmental migration that occurs due to some environmental changes and factors. There can be some internal migration within the country or within a region. There can be international migration, one country to another, and there's entire immigration process. And when you look into natural disaster, there can be two kinds of natural disaster. One is gradually occurring, very long period type of natural disasters like drought and climate changes. The other one is very sudden, like storm, floods, or earthquake. So we just want to establish some sort of relation between this migration pattern and natural disaster. And previous literature has focused this sudden natural disaster and look into mostly to the local labor market outcomes and internal migration. And there are several papers out of it within this topic. What we bring a new thing in the table is we are looking at how this sudden natural disaster affects the international labor migration. And I think this is a very unique thing that we bring with this paper. So actually there are two hypotheses, and these two hypotheses are puzzling with each other. The very first hypothesis is, you know what, this international labor migration, it is just a post-disaster adaptation strategy to recover from like disaster-induced income loss or trying to seek some better employment opportunities. Therefore, after this disaster, maybe there should be an increase in international labor migration. Counter to that, there's another hypothesis which says, you know what, there's like when the sudden environmental disaster occurs, it may attract new employment and income opportunity within the land. So therefore, people will not leave from the land because there is much more opportunity to do reconstruction and there is much more opportunity within the country. So we also want to disentangle this wrangling hypothesis with each other. So it's also very fascinating work for us to, like, let's see what are the broader literature and what we can find. So our research question is, what are the causal effects of this sudden natural disaster on international labor migration? So when we ask this research question, we consider the case of 2015 Nepal's earthquake as a case, because this earthquake is, as we say, as good as randomly assigned. Nobody predicted the earthquake. It came and it sorted out people to go to international labor migration or not to go to international labor migration. Since this earthquake can be as good as randomly assigned to these international migration status, what we want to do is we want to find how much it affects certain regions. Here in this example, the dotted point here, that is the bar path where the origination of earthquake was, and the shaded black areas or the districts are the severely affected districts based upon the NRA's definition, and the rest of the district, despite the fact everybody suffered in this earthquake, despite the fact these are least affected district. So we basically want to compare how labor migration are in this dark district compared to the light colored district. So in this research design, we have used difference in difference framework to evaluate how changes in international migration per capita between district that are severely affected, which we call treated group, to the otherwise district. And we use the definition from the Nepal National Reconstruction Authority from National Planning Commission, which classified these 14 districts as severely affected district. And the second research design is the interactive fixed effect within the difference in difference framework. I think we're pretty much very first people to do this, and where we carefully account for potential unobserved heterogeneity or omitted variable bias or nationwide time period. Or in other words, maybe there is this huge general tendency of migration, and our difference in difference capture that general tendency rather than the causal effect. So we kind of fix this. And there's a recent paper that came in AER in 2022 that advocates why it is really important to capture the interactive fixed effect. And again, these papers are by Guido Imbens and Susan Athy and other colleagues. So we're really excited to, just to show a more relevant example with their theoretical arguments with the interactive fixed effect model. They are using something called synthetic difference in difference there. And furthermore, we also implement different types of robustness check. We did the event study, we did several placebo tests, alternative identification strategy, and we also use the nightlight satellite data as well. So what we bring into the table is we are looking at this empirical result or the linkages between natural disaster and labor market responses. And mostly we are focusing on our contribution on this quasi-experimental research-based design. Despite the fact there are several works like in how this earthquake affects foreign aid, mobility, health, education-related outcome, and also the allocation of aid, what we have not yet studied is the international labor migration. And that is a new topic we bring into the table here. So let me go ahead and try to talk about the data we use. So this data is from the Department of Foreign Employment, which we have the work permit issue by district over different gender, like male or female gender, from 2010 until 2016-17 fiscal year. We also have the district level population projection from the CBS for 2011, 12, 15, and 17. Because population are very slow moving variable, we can interpolate the missing variable, missing data in between. So that's what we did. We also look into the international labor migration for 100,000 population, and we take the natural log of that number. And we also include several variables like agriculture productivity, which we gathered from the Nepal Living Standard Survey. We'll also look into the district level aid disbursement from AIMS. And we also include the satellite-derived nightlight intensity as a proxy for GDP level, district level GDP. We also include the district level peak ground acceleration from the US Geological Services survey. This basically captures, rather than like defining district from which are more affected versus least affected, we can use a continence measure of the ground sake. And finally, we have done the NRA's definition of which districts are severely affected and which are not. So these are various data we include in our research. So this is busy table, but quickly wanted to point you toward the left-hand side here. These are the districts which are severely affected by the earthquake as per the NPC's and the National Reconstruction Authority's definition. These are Bhaktapur, Dhading, Dolkha, Gorkha, Kathmandu, Kabre, Palanchok, Lalitpur, Makwanpur, Nuwakot, Okhaldunga, Ramechhap, Raswa, Sinduli, and Sindhupalchok. So again, I showed you this earlier. So these black area, these are those 14 districts. The dot here, this is the earthquake location, and the rest of the district within Nepal is the least affected district from the 2015 earthquake. And what we do here is we also plot the international labor migration per 100,000 population in a log transform version from 2011 to 2017. And what you see, the dark color, those have less labor migration, and the light color have higher labor migration. And as you see, toward the far western side of Nepal, there is a very few labor migration. And mostly toward the eastern part of the Nepal, or maybe mid-eastern or mid-western part of Nepal, we have seen a more labor migration. Furthermore, we have simply take the average between the treated group and the comparison group across the time period and plotted the general trend of international labor migration per 100,000 population. The solid line is for the comparison group, and the dotted line is for the average of those 14 treated districts. So you can see there's a general trend of labor declination in both the treated and comparison group for the total and for the male. But if you're looking at the female, it's kind of pretty much parallel to each other. And just looking at this graph, it somehow gives us an indication that maybe the earthquake did not really affect female too much compared to the male's decision for the international labor migration. However, this is just a general trend. We need to go ahead and look into more or estimate it more proper way. So for that, we use this 2x2 difference indifference framework, very straightforward. We got two groups. We have treated group, which are the 14 districts, which are affected due to the earthquake, and the rest of the district out of the 75 districts are called control group. And we have two time period. One is the before earthquake and post earthquake. So that is, both are these dummy variables. We have the pre and post, and then we take the interaction of treated and the post time period, and what we get is this nice standard difference in difference framework where index I and T represents district and year. And treat is a binary variable that takes the value of 1 for the affected district and 0 for the comparison district. Post is also a binary variable which takes a value of 1 for post-earthquake and 0 otherwise. And interaction treat to the post gives us another binary indicator variable, which takes a value for 1 for severely affected district and 0 for less severely affected district post 2015 earthquake. And the coefficient of interest here is this delta, which gives us the causal effect of earthquake on the labor migration decision. So as you see here, we're basically trying to look into what's the average for this side compared to this side for the dotted to the solid line. And that is called the difference in difference in a graphical way. But despite the fact we're using difference in difference framework, there may be some omitted variable bias due to time varying unobserved heterogeneity. For an example, as you see, there is a general declining trend for both treated and control group for the male labor migration as well as overall migration. So we do not want to associate these general trend, declination of general trend to our difference in difference framework, right? There's a general trend that we have a reduction of labor migration, which might not be triggered by earthquake whatsoever. So we do not want to attribute such general trend into our estimation. So to correct for that, we use the very flexible approach called interactive fixed effect model, which allows us to explicitly model nonlinear time varying heterogeneity within this difference in difference framework. So again, this is a very straightforward method, except we have the, we use the staggered version of difference in difference framework. Therefore, we call this too a fixed effect model. And we have the district fixed effect, time fixed effect, and this is a explicitly defined nonlinear time varying heterogeneity. Again, we use a little bit of a cross validation, a little bit of machine learning goes in the back end. Do not want to talk too much about that. But the key idea here is we define there is a common trend in a nation defined as F, and each districts are differently susceptible to that common trend, and that district level susceptibility given as this lambda. So the F is defined as factor and the lambda is defined as factor loading. Think of this as a principal component analysis. We have factors and factor loading, similar like that approach. The key idea, this interactive fixed effect model, it enables us to capture the susceptibility of each district to the international labor migration. And here is the main result. So the main results, we are again, there are so many things here. We've got 3 panels, panel A, B, and C. In the panel A, we look into total migration. In panel B, we look into the male migration. And in panel C, we look into the female migration. Within each of these panels, we have 2 unique estimations. One is the standard difference in difference framework. The other one is interactive fixed effect. And the coefficient of interest is given into this treat multiplied by post. And depending upon different model, we have the year or district fixed effect and the standard error are robust to heteroscedasticity for the difference in difference framework, whereas for the interactive fixed effect, we use the bootstrapped version of standard error. Therefore, we do not need to correct for the heteroscedasticity for the interactive fixed effect model. And we have, I think 10 or 9 years of the data, about 600 observations. So let's take a look into this column here. This is the column of the interest. The rest of these things kind of captures some sort of biases. So treat interacted with post. This is the coefficient we're interested on. As we see, again, these numbers has to be transformed in some way to give us a elasticity over here, as I showed you. So you have to exponent this number and take a -1 and then multiply it by 100 to get like a percentage change in the Y. But despite the fact we're not going to do that, just take a look into here. What we see is there's a general reduction in the international labor migration among treated group compared to the comparison group into the post-earthquake era. And that is also validated by the interactive fixed effect model, which is a little bit pronounced than the difference in difference framework. We see similar effect for the male migration as well, but we do not see any significant relationship in the female labor migration. So overall, it suggests that After earthquake, there's a general reduction of the international labor migration, and there is more pronounced reduction into the male labor migration, but not so much to the female labor migration. So these are our main results, but then how much we should trust the main result, right? So next thing what we do is we do some robustness check on our main results. So we begin with the event study framework. Again, this event study framework, this has been kind of tweaked with the interactive fixed effect. So this is the event study framework. This is a standard event study framework, except we include this interactive fixed effect model in top of it. And the vertical line here and the 0, that kind of differentiate our time period before the earthquake or after the earthquake. And we have got 6 periods before the earthquake, and we've got about 4 or 5 periods after the earthquake. And the 0 line, given as this horizontal line, shows no causal effect. And this side, the left-hand side of each of these plot gives us the pre-earthquake treatment effect. And as we see, there is pretty much no differences in terms of labor migration of treated versus comparison group before the earthquake. But after the earthquake, what we see is there's a generally reduction into the foreign labor migration into the treatment group compared to the comparison group. And we see the same effect about the male, but there is not much effect for the female. So what this event study shows is a pre-treatment parallel trend. And then the rest of the part is probably plausibly the causal effect of the earthquake onto the labor migration. Furthermore, we do several robustness check. We want to stress our result and want to falsify our results. We use different assumptions to falsify our result. If we are able to falsify our result, we find the condition at what the results can be falsified. And within that, if we cannot falsify the result, it will provide us more like a robustness check of our result. So what we do here is, instead of taking all the district of the Nepal as a comparison group, we just consider this light district, which are the first order neighbor of the treated group given in the dark colored district. And we exclude Nepal, we exclude the capital city here, Kathmandu, Bhaktapur, and Lalitpur, or the valley cities. And we simply compare this dark shaded area to the light shaded areas. And again, we find about the same effect. Yes, these effects are slightly less pronounced though, but as you see, it shows, yes, then generally there is a reduction of the foreign labor migration, but not so, because once we include the interactive fixed effect, we do not see any statistically significant evidence, but not so for the first order contiguous district, right? So let's do one more thing. Let's try to do select the second order neighbor. So these are the neighbor of the neighbors, right? Neighbor of the neighbor district. So these are called the contiguous contiguous of order 2, and we compare this contiguous of order 2 as a comparison group to the shaded area. And what we find, again, there is some effect there, and this becomes statistically significant. And as you see, it's probably, if you come to the closer, there is not much effect that people are leaving, but as you go farther apart, and it gives you more evidence of, yes, there is generally a decline of the international labor migration. Similarly, we also exclude the Tarai area because we share the open border with Tarai, and this is again the international work permit issue. So probably people from here are least likely to be affected by the earthquake into the Tarai belt. And we compare the rest of the district, excluding Tarai belt, to this dark area. And again, we see there is pretty much similar effect as the main result, about 34 and about -41, 0.41, and there's not much effect for the female. Again, we validate the same estimate from the main table. And finally, we also exclude some more districts here, which are contiguous with the India. Again, we cannot go to the, it's not feasible to go take a look into the district which are contiguous to China, because we do not have much of a labor migration or people moving in and out. But with India, we have this nice socioeconomic relationship. So we again exclude these entire districts which are contiguous to the India and only compare the remaining area to the dark area. And again, we see about the same effect here. There's a reduction of the total labor migration, and again, reduction of the male migration, but maybe a little bit some evidence here for the female labor migration, but not quite sure though. So one thing that, as you see in our research, we do not control for any variable. When we are doing this, we have general idea that when you run the difference indifference framework, you do not want to control for any variable which are time varying variable, because the treatment might affect those time varying covariates. So we do not include any controls, but our referee would think the otherwise, and he asked us to the referees asked us to at least include some sort of control variable, and they specifically focused on the regional GDP, despite the fact those GDP can be taken away from the district level fixed effect. So we did not have the data. What we did is we look into the satellite data and we look into the nightlight intensity, and we think, okay, this may be the proxy of GDP, because if there's a lot of nightlight, maybe that area, a lot of things are happening. So with that argument, we capture the nightlight data based upon the satellite imagery, and we control for the nightlight data here. And still our coefficient of interest is the interaction of treat and post. And what we see here is about the same effect as we show you in the main table. And furthermore, we change the definition, instead of taking the NRS definition, how about we take the definition from the USGS, so United States Geographic Surveys. So this survey defines the ground acceleration, and based upon the intensity of that ground acceleration, it defines earthquake into 4 different categories. A very light earthquake, where the PGA, or peak ground acceleration, is less than 0.02. And if it is in between 0.02 to 0.1, we define this as a moderate earthquake. And if it is in between 0.1 to 0.2, then we define this as strong earthquake. And in between 0.2 to 0.3, that's going to be very strong earthquake. And above 0.3 is going to be severe earthquake. So we basically look into the ground sake, the Richter scale, and we classify them into whether it's a severe, light, very strong, moderate sake. And we simply compare, okay, the severe district to the lightly affected district, and very strong with the light affected district, strong to the light affected district, and moderately affected district to the light affected district. And as you see, as we relax this assumption, what we see is there's a reduction of the statistical significance, again suggesting, this earthquake do affect, like severely affected area are definitely affected by the earthquake in terms of international labor migration. And as we relax that assumption, what we see is there's a least affected. For an example, look into this moderate to light, we do not see much of an effect there. So yes, what it shows is, okay, if there is this light to moderate comparison, then we might not see any effect, because earthquake do not really affect people's behavior for the international labor migration toward the area which are moderate to lightly affected. And we find similar results with the male and as well as the female, consistent with the main table. And finally, what we did is something called randomization. We define this treatment group as NRAs. We define this treatment group from the definition of the USGC. Now, what we do is, let me just randomly define treatment group, right? I'm just trying to find the, hold on a sec. I got some comments onto the chat. Should I answer them right away, or should I wait?
Let's wait, if you don't mind, Dr. Shakya, because we're almost finished.
All right.
And
okay.
I hope our viewers will also understand. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that. So what we did here is we randomly assigned the treatment definition. Maybe sometime the Sunsari district is treated group. Maybe sometime Ramechhap district is a treatment group. So we randomly assigned this, and we created this placebo distribution. This is like kind of a null distribution, right? And we look into the 95% a bound of this placebo distribution, and we look into our actual treatment effect. And what we find is our actual treatment effect is way far apart from this placebo effect, suggesting the effect that we see is not statistically fluke relationship. It exists because it exists, because the earthquake really affected. So as you see here, we have for difference-indifference framework and for the interactive fixed-wave model, we find this event, the effect are pretty much consistent with the total and the labor migration, but not so for the female. And again, with the interactive fixed-wave, we find about the same effect and not so much with the females' labor migration. So again, it shows that our results are not due to the statistically fluke. These results exist because probably due to the earthquake. Now, moving to the discussion, as we saw, I showed these two hypotheses as labor migration as a post-disaster adaptation strategy versus maybe there's a reduction of labor migration. And if we look into this, we might go ahead and try to validate the second hypothesis because we have a reduction of the foreign international labor migration. But then again, we have to hold our thought, like, is it really true in Nepal's case? So we go ahead and try to do some mechanism analysis. So we look into, maybe let's compare districts which are agriculturally more productive versus less productive. Let's look into the district which have more labor productivity than the other district. And let's look into the district which have more aid disbursement to the other districts. So when you do this with the triple difference-indifference framework, again, not going to go in detail, but what we see is this interaction treat posting channel, which we see no effect at all whatsoever. So none of these mechanisms, despite the fact there's a good literature that these mechanisms might affect the international labor migration into the least developed countries, we do not find such for the Nepal. And that leads us to, again, rethink about the second hypothesis, why or what are the reasons for this reduction of the foreign labor migration? Does it because of this hypothesis true, or there is something else? So we come up with these 5 different explanatory notes, I would say. Again, we have not tested it, but it comes as anecdotal evidences. So first of all, this international labor migration is a huge cost for average Nepalese citizen in comparison to the per capita income. So because of this, after the earthquake, we do not have, resources to gather up this money, this start a fund or cost to go for the international labor migration. So probably that may be the reason. Again, we haven't tested it, but some anecdotal evidence. Furthermore, what we have found is after the earthquake, there's a huge influx of the remittance flow, at least 27% increase in 3 months after the earthquake compared to the same period for the last year. And also this is a huge increase within the South Asian region as well. So it shows that, okay, there's a more flow of the fund into the Nepal after the earthquake. So maybe there is this more opportunity within the Nepal to reconstruct Nepal. There are also several political forces like bureaucratic hurdles or political transition at that time, which ended up happening, this disbursement of relief package to be delayed up to 3 years. So maybe people do not have any additional resources to think about going to foreign labor migration. At the same time, we also promulgated a new constitution, the Federal Republic of Nepal in 2015. Possibly this signaled a hope for a better and stable elected government. Therefore, people decided not to leave the country. Not so sure, because that was followed by the economic blockade from the India in Nepal. And that played a significant role because the fuel cost was super high at that time period and the mobility significantly declined in that time period. And at the very same time, we also have the dispute with Singapore labor migration, and we reduced lots of, Malaysia. Malaysia reduced a lot of labor import from Nepal. So with these, just to quickly conclude, our result shows that there is generally a reduction of international labor migration post-earthquake. And that effect is heterogeneous to the gender, male being much more affected compared to the female. Maybe this is just a number because of the selectively number female goes to the foreign abroad in Nepal compared to the male. And one thing that we haven't really analyzed is what are the causal mechanism, because when we go in this direction, we need to have data. And again, we do not have much of a data at this very time. So that's somewhere we are kind of lagging behind in this research, but maybe that's a future work. So with that, thank you so much. Back to you, Prabinji, and back to you, Rabia.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Shakya. Dr. Malik, would you want to take over for the next 10 minutes if you could provide comments, suggestions? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Sorry, I'm just pulling up my comments here. Thank you for that presentation, and thank you everyone at IADS for the invitation. This was a really, really interesting and important paper. And you know, it has implications for so many other countries and so many other situations, which I think is really interesting. And it was really well written and very carefully analyzed. So as I was reading, you know, I would think, well, maybe you want to think about, for instance, treatment severity, and then you go ahead and do that, and then, you know, and so on. So it was really nice that you thought about all the robustness checks that I could think of, and I really liked the treatment severity and the placebo tests in particular. And I, you know, there were questions coming in the comments as you were presenting, and there's lots of, I think, interesting questions about the specifics of what you have done. In my case, I'm going to try to focus a little bit more on the sort of broader implications, because, you know, it's a published paper, which is great, congratulations, but I was thinking about things that I thought were really interesting, some that I wanted to just hear more about because I'm curious. I don't know much about Nepal. I know a lot more about Pakistan, which is in the region and has some similarities, but also some differences. And so hopefully, you know, this can open the discussion up for possible future research ideas in particular. I think if broadly, like 4 comments. The first one, though, is maybe a little bit specific because this was just primarily out of curiosity, since you know the context really well. The figure 3, which you also showed in the presentation with the migration trends before and after the earthquake, was interesting because I was curious to know substantively what is going on with the migration overall patterns and the male migration pattern before the earthquake. So looking at the years that you present to us, it seems like in 2010, the migration numbers are fairly similar, a little bit different between the districts that became treated versus control, and then they kind of diverge for those again. And so I was curious, what was going on, but also because that led me to think about, you know, if the earthquake hadn't occurred in any case. And sort of related to that, and it's prompted, I think, by one of the comments that I saw in the chat as well, you know, are the treated districts, I know that the earthquake is random, but ones that are more prone to earthquakes historically, I don't know this Nepal's context, and if it is, like, could that affect their responsiveness as well? Just like a tiny thing that I think would be interesting to think about. The second comment is, this is maybe a little bit outside of what you're interested in. So this is just coming from me, interested in the migration aspect of what you're talking about. I'd love to just learn more from you about the process of migrants getting these jobs that that help them go abroad, in part because I'm working on something to do with international labor migration in Pakistan, and I was curious if the process is similar in Nepal. So first, just very basic on the data, you're looking at district level data, and I was just curious if this refers to, does the data capture where people live, or is it capturing the place that they get their jobs from, because it's looking at the district, you know, talk about the district permits. And I asked that because maybe this is different in Nepal, but in Pakistan, people will often travel to bigger cities because that's where all the jobs are for going abroad. So there are these licensed agents or overseas employment promoters is what we call them, and they exist in the bigger cities, and they're the ones who help you get these jobs. And I was wondering if that's similar or different. And in part, I was also curious about this because is it possible that if they do exist in the larger cities, or actually even if they don't, were they affected by the earthquake damage? So because there was so much infrastructural destruction that happened in the wake of the earthquake, is it possible that these districts had the agents in these districts had fewer jobs that they could recruit migrants from? And could that be another sort of explanation to add to what you find? And because maybe they went out of business temporarily, maybe they lost their offices, they just weren't as well placed. And again, I think this, it's not maybe necessarily very closely relevant to what you're looking at, but I think it's really interesting. I also feel like there's a whole paper to write about how job availability is affected. Because again, in Pakistan, so if, like, say that there's a construction company in the UAE that wants to hire 150 construction workers, they will establish a contract with a formal agent in Pakistan somewhere, and then that agent will kind of help them recruit. And so if those agents are less able to position themselves to get those large international contracts, could that also affect just the availability? So maybe people want to apply for jobs, but they couldn't because they just didn't, they didn't exist at that point. My third comment is to do with thinking more about the broader implications for other contexts. So I know like the South Asian region is very prone to earthquakes, especially Nepal because of the mountains. But even by Nepal standards, this was a very massive, huge earthquake. And so I'm curious whether you think a smaller one wouldn't necessarily have had the same effect because, maybe the relief packages aren't as big for smaller earthquakes, or there's not as much incoming remittances, like some of the explanations that you talked about. Do you think smaller, in any context, smaller disasters wouldn't have quite the same effects? And related to that, do you think this pattern that you find, the negative effect on the treated districts, does it mirror what happened, you think, to internal migration? Because again, I was thinking about the explanations, you don't want to go too far from home was one of the things that you talked about because of the vulnerability of families, because they're waiting for their relief packages and the cost of international migration. Are those things maybe less concerned? So if it's a big disaster, do we expect to see maybe more internal migration when we see less of international migration? Like how do these sort of things work together? I think it could, a whole other paper you could write that would be really interesting as well. And just the last thing on those explanations, I know you said they're anecdotal, but I just think they're so interesting. And I feel like you could, again, do a whole project based on trying to look at some of these. And I was wondering if your gender findings could help to kind of narrow them down a little bit. So I actually thought of this comment as you were presenting today, because I was thinking, okay, so female migration is not effective. So it's not affected. Is it because it's less costly? My guess is that it's just as costly for women to go abroad, but is it because they're seen as less responsible for staying with families when the family's vulnerable? So can you kind of use that to maybe think about which of the mechanisms or explanations that you discuss are more likely to be driving these results than others? And sorry, finally on that, like I was wondering if you think that there might be longer term effects. So on the one hand, I imagine a situation where, okay, once, remittances are coming in, so there's lots of local employment, so you don't need to go abroad, and you see that negative effect. On the other hand, is it possible that once the rebuilding has happened and the relief packages have come into our families, then we start thinking towards long-term and we're more scared that something similar is going to happen again. And so you want to kind of mitigate against that and be more financially secure. So in the longer term, you see a big jump in international migration from these districts. Like, so sort of, what do you think the long-term effects? Again, that could be a whole other paper. So I just want you to write like 5 more papers that come out of this that I think would be great. And then finally, my last comment is very quickly, I think this is more to open like a broader discussion, maybe a little bit less of an academic question. I'm just curious. I was trying to think about, okay, what can the government, any government, take out of these kinds of findings if they want to think about being more prepared for these kinds of disasters, because you can't really predict them. Because, on the one hand, the foreign aid and the remittances maybe helped residents find more employment and therefore stay longer. So is that something that governments need to rely on? Or was it because the families were vulnerable and so you don't want to leave? So if rehabilitation had been quicker, would people have left? Does the government want people to have international, like to migrate internationally because it brings more remittances back? And if that's the case, then how can they kind of use these findings to maybe think about how to be better prepared so that people aren't unable to go abroad if that's what they want in response to such sorts of unfortunate disasters? Okay, I'm pretty sure that was more than 10 minutes. I will stop now, but thank you so much again. I really enjoyed reading the paper.
Dr. Shakya, would you want to respond quickly before we look at the questions?
Thank you. Thank you, Rabia. It is very well thought comments. And I think we have several answers to these comments, and there are several things I think those gonna like extend to the possible extension of this paper. So the first, as you say, this migration trend in figure 3. So what we have is a panel data. We have data from 2010 until 2017 for 75 districts. Among that, 14 districts are treated group and the remaining districts are control group. And obviously, I think the figure will show a general trend, but there's also this inherent general trend. Maybe there's a nationwide, because people have to leave from Nepal to rest of the other world to seek for the foreign labor employment, but there may be a general trend. I mean, people are just leaving. They're just leaving, right? And not because of earthquake or whatsoever. They're just leaving because so many reasons that I cannot capture in my data. So exactly for that purpose, we use the interactive fixed effect. So if you look into, I did not show in the slide here, but if you look into our paper, we have the factors and factor loading plotted, which captures the general trend and how much each districts are uniquely susceptible to that general trend. So in a way that potentially answer your question. The second one is about getting jobs and where at which location. So interestingly, in Nepal, what happens is, despite the fact I can go to maybe capital city to get my passport, but my passport will always be issued from where my citizenship is. So my citizenship is, let's say, from a particular district, let's say District A, despite the fact I may go to the capital city to expedite my passport process, but within my passport, it is always written the district. So what it captures is for the person who has the citizenship registered and he issued the passport for the foreign labor migration. So probably the issue that you showed about the district, maybe not much in Nepal, because it is usually issued from the district level. In terms of broader context, possibly the thing that may be interesting is to look into like meta-analysis. Let's find all these like earthquake things, right? Let's find all the earthquake paper and let's take a look into the labor effects, do some meta-analysis, and probably that will allow us to generalize. Again, all the causal effects are local average treatment effect. That means by definition, we're going to be pretty much localized. We cannot really generalize. At least in terms of Nepal's context, this is what it is. But if you want to generalize, do not really know. It's a tough job to generalize anything, right? So anything that can be generalized, we define that as a law, like law of demand or law of supply. I do not want to. I don't think like we can ever find law of earthquake on labor migration. So I think that is a tough job, but I think meta-analysis would be one way to go. And as you see, maybe you should look for the smaller earthquake. Maybe let's say I think in about 2010-11 there was a small earthquake, 4 Richter earthquake in Nepal. So maybe we can look into that. But contrary to that, what we also do is we use the USGC definition for severe, moderate, light. So, just giving some comparison, it's like, despite the fact BARPAC was about 7.3 or 7.9 Richter scale, but that disassociates as you go farther apart. So yes, there may be some ground trembling, but that's not too much as it is nearby the BARPAC. In terms of internal migration, frankly, we just do not have any data on it. Just cannot do anything. And in US, we have like this county by county like labor migration, because as they go, they register the driving license or whatnot. So you have the record. But unfortunately here in this case, we just cannot do anything. That's why we have to think about the satellite data. Any district that is more illuminated, maybe there's a lot of things happening. So in terms of anecdotal thing, as you say, gender finding, I think that might help us narrow down. But also in terms of female, like lots in Nepal, there is a general tendency that the male has to take care of the household, and in terms of financially, and the female may not. Female will take care of household in terms of like household chores and all this stuff. But if you look into female, if they are going to foreign labor migration, these are selectively different female than the generic population female. So because of that very reason, maybe we do not see much effect among these females. Again, we cannot really identify their, like passport number or anything. I wish we can identify their like individual observable characteristics, but that's not going to happen yet. And in terms of, I think, rebuilding happening, I think that's really interesting, looking at how the rebuilding happens and how the effect of earthquake in a longer trend. That is something, it has been frequently came into when I presented this paper, including Pankaj Koirala, he's also here. He also suggested similar comment to me. So that is something in future work, probably we will try to look into. But again, as we go like farther apart from the event, there could be so many other dimensions that could have affected the outcome variable. So despite the fact, if we catch it, is it a causal effect or is it a spurious effect? Again, we need to kind of hand wave there. And finally, about the policy response, frankly, at least in terms of like post-earthquake disasters, I mean, we need to develop cities or urban locations, right? And if you look into like Mancu's idea, maybe we need to find area, a very like there's nothing, and bring selectively people into that area and develop that areas in terms of all the lessons we have learned, right? That would be a better way. But again, the country being more not to our market-oriented solution, it's again cannot possibly do that. I don't think like any kind of other approach than market can allow us and the rule of law can allow us. But yes, policy responses would be a nice thing, which I'm not quite suited to do this kind of analysis. I'm more like applied work. So I'm going to like kind of hand wave. So please forgive me onto that. Back to you, Prabin. Thank you so much, Rabia. Interesting comment.
Dr. Malik, thank you so much. And Dr. Shakya, thank you for responding to Malik, Dr. Malik's comments. So I'll just go through a few questions quickly. Some of these questions you've already answered, Shishir. The first two are actually from Dr. Alok Bora. Is there a way to capture the level of severity effect? I think you've answered that, but I'll still go through the questions. Did you control for the past migratory pattern and or other pull-push factors? These are the two questions from Dr. Bora. The third question is, how can we use satellite-derived night light intensity as a proxy for district-level GDP? So could you respond to these three questions first?
Sure, Alex, thank you so much. The severity is that we capture from the PJ. So I think that is answered. In terms of past migratory pattern, I think that would be really interesting to look. We haven't taken a look into that. And I think we also need to have the data, district level data for people to move. And I'm not sure we have like data going further back than 2010. But that is an interesting thing. Maybe past migratory pattern may have some effect. There may be some pull and push factor, obviously. One thing that we were thinking was to, so let's take a look from, let's say, a district, let's say Ramechhap, and how many people go to like Arab country versus Malaysia versus the rest of the world, so that we can capture the origin fixed effect and destination fixed effect. That kind, it's going to be like more like a gravity model, and it might capture pull and push factor. That is something in my head. I recently did a similar paper in terms of US labor migration, where we tried to capture that pull and push factor. But I think, thank you for putting that into our radar. I think this is going to be a publishable paper using gravity model, thinking about pull and push factor. Saurabhji, you said, how can we use satellite-derived nightlight intensity as a proxy for district level GDP? So I think there are several papers published in 2021 in World Development and Journal of Development Economics. So take a look into that. The key idea is, let's look into the satellite data. Let's look into the, like the Earth space where there is more lights, there may be more GDP, right? You can, a quick example would be look into the satellite map of North Korea and South Korea. And you'll see South Korea and North Korea, they are virtually similar people. Their culture are similar. They eat the similar food. They're about the similar, except they have different regime. And one country, there's like entire, like only the Pyongyang in North Korea is kind of eliminated a little bit. And in South Korea, that's like entire South Korea is eliminated, right? And just capturing that nightlight, you can capture like the amount of GDP. And there are several research that is happening recently. I have one idea paper going on with several people. What we look into, like maybe dictators kind of predict their GDP pretty much well, because they have the upper say to, what's my GDP going to be? They can apply in terms of the nightlight. So we're kind of capturing the nightlight intensity and the countries which have less economic freedom or more dictatorship, and we kind of take a look into that. So those are some interesting ideas. And this nightlight intensity is going to be a really interesting research question to maybe pursue forward. And there are several data, I think. Take a look at, I forget which source we use, but I have put in a citation for the paper, which we use the satellite derived data, and they provide a raster file. You can look into that raster file, plot the spatial object on top of that, and then maybe you have like district level, the geodata, and then you can plot that and kind of capture the district level data as well. Again, one way to capture this. But at the same time, if you think like econometrically, these doesn't change, or district level effect doesn't change over the time period, or there is some sort of district level invariant effect. So usually district level fixed effects should capture those effects econometrically, but if you want to impose a variable, that's going to be cool as well. Back to you, Prabinji.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Shakya. Two more questions. This is from Pankaj Koirala. There could be several other variables such as flow of supports on reconstruction of earthquake-affected communities. These supports could have increased domestic labor supply. What do you think about this possibility? That's the first question. The second is again from Dr. Bora. Since this is not a RCT, some sort of matching method could also be applied. Would you want to respond?
Thank you, Pankaj. Yeah, I think that's a good one to look into the flow of support. I'm not sure which variable to look into that. If you can just DM me, I would appreciate. But that is interesting. Let's say if there are within the treated group, if there's a flow of support heterogeneity, then possibly finding that will give us some idea. But again, the flow of support, it was delayed up to 3 years. In 3 years, many things could have happened in between. Again, I think that's going to be a cool idea, but I will, back of my head calculation, I don't think we're going to really find any effect just capturing flow of support, because it was really delayed, like up to 3 years, right? And people, despite the fact we might not need the support because they just have a way to register their name as an earthquake victim, can also get the support. So there is that selective issue that goes ahead as well, because people who are already much more capable to go ahead and register themselves as earthquake victims usually get this support. So there is several, one or two research paper, actually, I think World Development as well, they kind of look into this aid disbursement. From my back of my calculation, maybe not, we may not find those effects, but maybe interesting research here. Alok, I think, yeah, obviously it's not a randomized controlled trial. It's more like an assumption that earthquake was as good as randomly assigned to the treated and control group. And as you say, the matching method, for matching methods, we need district level data set, because we want to match the observables to treated and control group. Unfortunately, we just do not have the district level data set. Therefore, we kind of rely on two-way fixed effect or the standard difference in difference framework. But at the same time, there's a recent paper from Santana and Callaway, 2022. They say that if the treatment is as good as randomly assigned, despite the fact you do not include any observable covariates to match, you're still fine, because sometimes if you impose, like, let's say some observables like education, right? That could affect, but earthquake also affect education. So those becomes like time varying variables. And if I impose that into my regression, it's called collider bias, because the earthquake also affect the education, and education also is going to affect the labor migration, and it creates like all sort of problem with the causal chain, which we call like directed acyclical graph. So I'm kind of not sure that should we even think about matching, because compared to difference in difference matching model, it needs more stringent assumptions than the difference in difference framework. But had we had the lot of observables, yes, we could have matched, but unfortunately, we just do not have the data. Yeah, thank you so much. Prabinji, back to you.
Prabin, you're muted, I think.
Thank you, Rabia. So there's a question from Mr. Bhai, whoever you are, Mr. Bhai, and it's a long question. He says, in Western Nepal, migration data shows sparsely compared to East. I guess he means maybe less observations in the West, but seasonal migration or migration to India is more frequent in the West. The women out migration in certain districts must be higher, for example, Sindhu Palchok, and the socioeconomics dimension is contrast compared to other districts. Any typical notable example in such districts about migration and other variables? That's a question to you, Shishir. Lastly, when was the study conducted? Because the time series data of migration seems moderate. Any limitation on data sourcing? Would you want to answer this? Because it's a long question. You can have a look.
Yeah. Thank you, Vai. This is an interesting question. yes, these are important, important issue, but like, I think we control these in an indirect way, because let's think about district level migration. Yes, there are different districts which are differently susceptible, right? So we capture those in terms of interactive fixed effects. And we also capture that in terms of the fixed effects. So these district level invariant effect are usually captured within the model with the fixed effects. So we do not really worry about that. Seasonal migration, again, we have the annual data, so we do not have anything about seasonality there. As you said, Sindhu-Palchok may have a different socioeconomic demographic profile than the other district, and yes, that might trigger different types of migration. For an example, if you go look into the far western part of Nepal, where there's nearby Seti, Acham, Seti, around that area, what you find is there's more female population into that districts compared to the male population. Assam, Safe Bagar, yes, that's the right place. So because there's a lot of labor already, like male usually go to the India for the labor migration, and that result to a different types of female to labor ratio. But again, usually district level fixed effects should capture this. But lastly, when was the study? So the study was, we have data from 2010 to 2017, and that's the best case data we can get for our research. And yes, and in terms of limitation of data source, I think one thing we must need to think about is the open border with India, because if people are gonna go work from Nepal to open border India, we're not gonna have any record for that migration, because we have open border with the India. You do not need like passport and the visa to go to India. As long as you can show your citizenship or any name identifying documents like driving license, you can usually easily go in and out from the Nepalese border to Indian border, and from the other way around as well. And I think that is a severe limitation in our data. Again, something that we just cannot do anything about it. Thank you, Vai. Those are really interesting and nice comments. Back to you, Prabinji.
Right, now from Ms. Srijana Koirala, as there were around 7 lakhs, which is 700,000, ladies and gentlemen, houses to be reconstructed in the affected district, this may have created demand of reconstruction labor in the district itself, discouraging labor migration. I worked for 5 years in NRA, and many of the villagers now are looking forward to labor migration, as post-construction is almost over now. I think this research must be done in a periodic basis. Know the time frame or absorption period where labor migration is affected by the earthquake. I think this is a great point.
Over to this is going to be fun. Yeah. Is there any way we can identify where this reconstruction happened, like lat and long of houses or something like that? Because when these reconstruction happens, I think the NRA provides some funding, I guess. Is there any way to capture that? Srijana, would you mind commenting on that, please?
Yes, Ms. Srijana Koirala.
Yeah, actually, there is a database that is captured in MI system in central office of NRA, but I guess that is hand over to NDRRMA, that is a National Disaster Risk Reduction Authority, which is newly created. And you can find the data from the office. And NRA is disclosed now, and it has handed over all the information to NDRRMA. And you can get all the data like how many houses were reconstructed in which ward, and how many houses were retrofitted. And you can get data on the basis of first installment, second installment, and the final installment. So you can also find the time period on how many houses were constructed. And I think that might be helpful for you.
Thank you, Srijana. That's really interesting. I think this is a new research topic. I'm really excited about looking at this data. If I got 700,000 observations of which houses were reconstructed, right, just putting the lat and long on top of it, I can pretty much probably find the effect within that. And I think look into the post-reconstruction era effect on the labor migration. I think
they also have the GPS of each reconstructed household. So
Absolutely, that's very important.
That will be a good point for you. And I was just wondering, because I worked in the local level, and they were engaging in reconstruction project for the time being, and now they had invested a lot of money for their household because the grant provided by the government was not quite enough. So they are now looking forward to the labor migration, and that's why I was saying that you can have a periodic type of resource so that to find out the absorption time of the disaster like earthquake.
Thank you. Would you mind dropping your email address? I'm going to send you another email. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
okay,
exactly.
thank you.
I mean, great synergy. Thank you, Srijanaji. Also, I think, looking at that data set, if that data exists, then great political outcomes, right? Especially given now we're, are going to face 2 big elections. So thank you, Srijanaji. Anyone else, ladies and gentlemen, would you want to ask Dr. Shakya any questions if you have? If not, then we're almost, we're only 5 minutes before, the stipulated time is up. So we can actually say goodbye 5 minutes before.
Can I quickly, sorry, Prabin, can I very quickly follow up on that last, that's okay. Can I quickly follow up on the last thing that you were just discussing? Because I think it's really, really interesting, and it kind of fits into what I was asking earlier about, you do the reconstruction and then you think about migrating. But just 2 quick things, like if you can find that data, that's fantastic. And I think you should work with it. But is there any way, which you probably don't know yet, but I think like the first thing to think about would be with the NRA, like how do they decide where to build the houses first? Because just, do political connections or whatever matter for who gets their house rebuilt first, and how would that influence the decision to migrate, right? But even if it's not about migration, I just feel like there could be something so interesting with that data about just like the politics of it. I think could be, even if you don't work on the migration aspect, you should absolutely write a paper with that on the politics of who gets their house rebuilt first, and looking at, I don't know, maybe competitiveness of the last election or something, maybe like a regression discontinuity with like close elections and where houses were rebuilt first. Sorry, I'm making this a political science paper because that's what I work on. But I feel like even if you can't do the migration thing, because of, I would be concerned about the identification of who gets their house built first, and is it people who are more likely to migrate anyway? But please look for that data and write some excellent paper with that. Thank you.
I'm looking forward for this data. Actually, it's interesting. That data gonna be interesting. It's gonna be pretty interesting. Yeah.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your presence today. I'd again like to thank Dr. Shakya for such a wonderful presentation, and Dr. Malik, thank you so much for your wonderful comments. Thank you for being willing to be a discussant here with us here today at IDS. So having said that, ladies and gentlemen, see you next month. And we're going to be having some more interesting papers focusing around natural disasters, because we'll be soon, I think in our fifth year or 6th year, the earthquake anniversary. So the papers will be focusing on natural disasters. Thank you once again. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.